The headline screams toughest sanctions ever against Iran, but the real target isn't Tehran. The U.S. Treasury is deploying a strategic trap designed to force Beijing into an impossible choice: absorb massive economic costs by cutting ties with Washington's primary adversary, or face secondary sanctions that sever their own access to global trade corridors and the dollar system. This isn't about crushing Iran. It's a high-stakes test of whether China will prioritize its relationship with Tehran over its integration into the Western financial order. When leaders announce such sweeping measures, the immediate narrative focuses on the isolated nation in question. We read headlines as morality plays or simple economic penalties designed to cripple a rogue state. But in realpolitik analysis, we must look past the stated objective to see who actually bears the cost and why that design matters for global stability today. The United States is not merely tightening nooses around Iran's economy, it is constructing a leverage point specifically calibrated to fracture great power alliances. The mechanism driving this strategy relies on what experts call secondary sanctions. Unlike primary sanctions, which target direct transactions, these punitive measures punish third-party nations and their corporations for doing business with the sanctioned entity. As seen in previous reimposition cycles following the withdrawal from nuclear agreements, major global corporations exited Iranian markets not out of moral pressure but to avoid losing access to the dollar-based financial system. The goal is to make continued trade with Iran more expensive than cutting it off entirely. This approach creates a scenario where Washington does not need to physically blockade Tehran to achieve strategic disruption. Instead, they weaponize China's dependence on global markets. By threatening secondary sanctions that target banks and shipping firms facilitating Iranian oil sales, the U.S. forces Beijing into a calculation of survival rather than ideology. The question shifts from whether Iran should be isolated to whether China can afford to keep it connected without destroying its own economic foundation. Quick resource note: I keep a curated set of Amazon search links in the description for books, gear, and tools relevant to this channel's topics. Some are affiliate links, so I may earn a commission at no extra cost to you. Please consider supporting the channel by using those links if you find something useful. China faces a unique structural vulnerability in this equation that makes the trap particularly effective for Washington. Over one-third of China's crude oil supply transits through the Strait of Hormuz, which sits directly adjacent to Iranian territory. This geographic reality means any conflict or blockade in the region creates an immediate energy security crisis for Beijing that they cannot easily ignore without suffering severe economic self-harm. The data on this exposure is stark and visceral. Following a 12-day period of intense conflict between Israel and Iran earlier this year, market forces reacted with alarming speed. Brent crude prices rose from an average of $71 per barrel in February to roughly $100 by March 2026. Simultaneously, Asian liquefied natural gas prices jumped from $13 per million British thermal units in early 2025 to nearly $21 just a year later. These are not abstract numbers for policy wonks. They represent the immediate inflationary shock hitting Chinese manufacturing and consumer costs when energy flows become uncertain. This economic pressure point becomes even more critical given the nature of China's current alliances. Analysts often describe a deepening alignment between Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, and Pyongyang as an axis of upheaval or crank block. However, this grouping lacks binding mutual defense clauses that would force automatic military intervention on behalf of any single member. The Strategic Partnership Treaty signed in January 2025 between Russia and Iran is driven by shared grievances against Western pressure rather than hard security guarantees that bind them together indefinitely. Consequently, while Beijing can offer rhetorical support to Tehran, it will likely hesitate to absorb the direct economic costs associated with a full-scale confrontation. The Chinese leadership has already begun revising growth forecasts downward, dropping from 4.5% to 4.4% in 2026 due to regional instability and trade disruptions. Maintaining an alliance that jeopardizes domestic stability becomes increasingly difficult when the cost of doing business rises faster than economic output. The United States is leveraging this hesitation by highlighting how 8 of China's top export markets, including India, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, have already seen import growth slashed due to the ongoing conflict. By forcing a choice between these shrinking Asian markets or retaining Western financial access, Washington creates a scenario where maintaining the status quo with Iran becomes economically unsustainable for Beijing. The trap is simple. Either cut ties with Tehran to save your trade corridors and keep energy prices manageable, or accept secondary sanctions that cripple the very economy you are trying to protect while risking total isolation from the dollar system. If China refuses to decouple from Tehran, they risk being locked out of global financial infrastructure just as their own growth trajectory requires maximum access to Western capital markets. This dynamic changes how we must view every future headline regarding sanctions. It is no longer just an economic penalty on a rogue state, but a geopolitical lever used to fracture great power alliances and redefine the cost of challenging U.S. hegemony without paying a price that cripples domestic prosperity. The stakes are now about whether Beijing can maintain its growth trajectory while simultaneously supporting Tehran, or if they must choose between their strategic partners and their own economic survival. The outcome will define the next decade of international relations. If China absorbs the cost to stay aligned with Iran, it signals a willingness to endure significant domestic pain for geopolitical leverage, potentially accelerating a global bifurcation into two distinct financial spheres. However, if Beijing chooses to decouple from Tehran under this pressure, it reveals that even deep strategic partnerships have limits when weighed against direct threats to national economic security and access to the dollar system. The current moment is not a negotiation but an ultimatum where China must decide if the alliance with Tehran is worth risking its integration into the global financial order. The U.S. strategy isn't just isolating Tehran, it's a test of Beijing's willingness to absorb the cost of continued engagement versus preserving access to the dollar-based system that underpins their own modernization efforts. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. I am a one-person team working hard to make each video better than the last. Subscribe if you found value. It is the best way to show support. Drop a comment with your biggest takeaway. See you in the next video.